Hi, my name is Robert O'Brien, and today I'm going to be demonstrating how to use the super high-tech flux capacitating patent applied for BR549 mortise and tenon / dovetail neck setting jig. This jig is a combination of several jigs that I've seen other builders use over the years. It used to be two separate components. One would be for cutting the body joint and the other would be for cutting the neck. One of my students has taken this one step further and designed a jig based on my design where you can now use the body on one side and the neck on one side, and in one simple easy operation cut both of them. The piece of angle iron coming out the top allows you to set the correct neck angle. You can cut the joint, be it mortise and tenon or dovetail, very quickly and easily and get on with life. To begin, I'm going to securely clamp the super high-tech flux capacitating jig to my bench or my work surface. What I'm using is just a Black & Decker workmate, and any bench would work. But the advantage of having the Black & Decker workmate is that on one side I can let it overhang and the body will not hit the bench, and on the other side there's a gap in there where the neck can go. The neck and the body are longer than the jig, so you need some place in the bench where it can pivot inside there. And the advantage of doing that is you can now cut the neck and the body joint at the same time. You don't have to put one in the jig, take it out, then put the other one in the jig, take it out. Now if you're doing a dovetail joint when you need to switch bits during the operation, it's another step. So it's better to just put them both in the jig at the same time, cut them both at once. Now this jig is designed so that you can cut either the mortise and tenon or a dovetail joint for your guitar. All you need to do is just swap out the templates. Now these templates come from LMI in the hardware kit for the jig, made out of 1/4 inch MDF, very easy to make, inexpensive. If you happen to run a router into it, not a big deal. So this is for the mortise and tenon. I'm going to swap these out and I'm going to put in the dovetail templates. The body template, or the mortise, is going to go on this side, and the tenon template for the dovetail will go on this side. Now I've already talked about setting this up, and you do want to do some test pieces so you're not practicing on your guitar. The templates are held in place with these little set screws. Right now, the tenon side of the jig, or the neck side, I'm going to place it so just that I have enough room to come in and cut the full depth of the neck here. Now the body side, I'll show you how to set that up. Let me just tighten these down real quick. And you just need them snug, you don't want to kill them. So the first thing I'm going to do is place the neck into the jig. Now I've got these 1/4 inch dowels that I've placed in here when I built the jig. And on my neck I've got a truss rod slot that just happens to be the exact same size, 1/4 inch. And it is centered on the neck. That's important. If this is not centered, then remove these dowels and place it in there so it's centered. So this is very easy to align. Just align it with the dowels in the trough and come in and clamp it off with the toggle clamps. The next thing I'm going to do is set the neck angle. And to do that, I'm going to take the guitar and I'm going to place it on top of the jig where this extends, this aluminum piece right here. So here's the guitar. It's placed on top of the jig like so. That aluminum rod extending there is simulating a straight edge being placed along the fretboard of the guitar. And what I like to see on my guitars at the saddle location is a gap between the bottom of the straight edge and the top of the guitar of 3.5 millimeters. Now I've got that marked on this guitar. Here's the saddle location right here. I've got a line drawn on there. And I want to see a gap between the bottom of that straight edge and the top of that guitar of 3.5 millimeters. If I don't have that, then I need to adjust the angle of the shelf where the neck is. And let me show you how to do that. On the bottom of the jig, on the body side or the mortise side, I'm just going to loosen this little knob. Then I'm going to come around to the other side of the jig on the neck side and adjust the angle of the shelf. Adjusting this in or out will adjust the angle of the shelf, and that's where the neck is clamped. So the neck is pivoting forward or back to give me that correct neck angle on my body. So just adjust this back and forth until you have the correct angle you need, or the correct gap, 3.5 millimeters at the saddle location. So here I am turning the knob on the bottom of the jig, And you can see that angle getting larger or smaller, depending on which way I go. And what I want is 3.5 millimeters at the saddle location. Now, these are for my guitars, and let me explain how I do that. 3.5 millimeter gap between the bottom of the ruler and the saddle location. And my idea is that my fretboards are going to come in at about 6.5 millimeters, or about a 1/4 inch. Those two measurements together give me 10 millimeters here. With the frets in, I now get 11 millimeter gap. That way I can come in and make my bridge for my guitars, my setup for what I want on my guitars, somewhere between the 9 and the 10 millimeter tall range. Now you're probably going to need to dial that measurement in to fit your specs for your guitars. But for my guitars, I want that gap after all is said and done of about 11 millimeters or so. So once you get that gap of 3.5 millimeters at the saddle location, then you can come in and tighten the knob on the body side or the mortise side, and that will clamp everything off, make sure it's all secured. So my neck is now set. I like the angle. I'm going to come in and just tighten this knob, and that's going to secure the shelf so there's no vibration while I'm cutting the joint, and it won't move on me. It will maintain the correct angle. Something else that's very important to call your attention to while you're setting the body and setting the neck angle here is make sure that the bottom down here in your heel block is flat on the surface, and that the top of the soundboard is touching this area here. And then check for your gap at the top. Okay, with the correct neck angle set, now I'm going to place the body into the jig on the mortise side. So to place the body into the jig, I've got a center line clearly marked on the guitar on the top here, and I've got a line clearly marked on the front side of my jig. I'm going to come in, place this in here. I've placed cork lining on these two surfaces that hold it in place. So come in, place that in the jig like that, and then come in, clamp it down. As you're placing the guitar into the jig, it's very important that the center line of your actual guitar top is aligned with the center line you drew on the front of your jig and the center line of your template. If it's not, then adjust it and make it work so that it is exactly on the center line. Now, sometimes the joint where the sides came together on the top is not the center line. Make sure that you have the center line of the top of your guitar. All right, I'm going to clamp this up until it cracks, and I'm going to back it off a 1/4 turn. No, I'm just kidding, guys. You don't want to do that. Just make it snug so that it holds the guitar. From the top side of the jig, you can see what I was talking about. Here's the center line on the front of the jig. The center line comes up in here. The actual center line of the joint on this guitar is a little off of center. So I've got a line exactly on my binding there, exactly where the center line of the guitar is, and it's a little bit left of the actual joint where the sides came together. Not a big deal. The next thing I need to do is adjust this in or out so that I only cut in as far as I need to. I don't want to blow out the back side of the guitar. I want to stop short of that. So I'll show you how I do that. Something else that you want to be careful of when you're putting the body into the jig is that because of the radiuses on the front and the back of the guitar, as you clamp this thing up, sometimes it will pivot one way or the other to accommodate the radius. Make sure that there's no gap inside there. Make sure that the guitar is not sitting this way or this way. Make sure it's centered and all the way up against the bottom of this plate. From the top side of the jig, now we need to determine how far to slide this into the jig so we determine how deep the cut's going to go into the body. Now on my guitars, this is the top, this is the back, and you're looking at it kind of upside down here. This is the top, this is the back. What I like to do is cut into the guitar just a skosh shy of the binding line, maybe about 1/8 of an inch or so shy of that binding line. Then the actual neck will cover up to the binding, and then once I place a heel cap on there about 2.5 millimeters or so, it should go right into about the middle of the binding. So there's actually a step down from the back of the guitar down to the heel cap. It's not flush like on a classical guitar. So I need to determine how deep into there I need to go. So I need to place my template in the correct location. Right now I'm going to place it so that the end of that template is about flush with the binding, because by the time I put my guide bushing in there and then the actual bit is a little smaller than the guide bushing, I should come in right in where I need it. Once I've done that, then I'm going to come in and tighten up these little set screws. Once again, don't over tighten them, just make them snug, and that's going to hold that template in place. Once I'm done tightening up the set screws, then I like to save my tool so I don't look for it around the shop or on the floor. So I've just drilled a little hole in the side of my jig here, and it just inserts into it like that. And it's always handy when I need it, and I'm not always looking for it. For cutting the joint, I'm going to be using a plunge router, and the plunge router allows me to cut the depths gradually as I proceed. So I do recommend a plunge router for this operation. Now what I'm going to be using is a 5/8 inch guide bushing. The outside diameter is 5/8, inside diameter is 17/32. So it's a very tight tolerance, a very thin wall guide bushing. And when I put that in there, I'm going to make sure that it is centered. So I'll use a centering pin to do that. So this goes into the router like so. And then I'm going to use a centering pin that goes into my router to make sure that that is indeed centered. Once you've determined that the guide bushing is indeed centered on your bottom plate of your router, then I'm going to come in. The first cut I'm going to make. Now on a dovetail mortise and tenon, you've got the angled edges. You also have the angle of the neck to worry about. So you have compound angles going on. So what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a 3/8 inch straight cut bit. This one just happens to be a 1/2 inch shank. I prefer the larger shanks. And then I'm going to use that to hog out the majority of the material. After that, I'm going to come in and place in the dovetail bit. That's going to cut the angle on what was left. Now, I've got to go smaller with a 3/8 inch bit instead of a 1/2 inch bit. If I were cutting a regular mortise and tenon, straight side mortise and tenon, I'd be using a 1/2 inch cut bit to do the whole thing. But since I have to hog out the majority of the material first, I've got to use a 3/8 inch bit. Then I'm going to come in with the 7-degree taper, 7-degree angle on this dovetail angle. And that will put the angle I want on the walls of both the mortise and the tenon part of the joint. So I'm going to place the 3/8 inch straight cut bit into the router and tighten it up. Make sure that it is indeed snug in the collet. You don't want any surprises while you're using the router. Another beauty of this jig, since we have to switch bits mid-operation and put in the dovetail bit, is that you can do both of the straight cuts at once. You've got the body on one side, you've got the neck on the other. You can come in and do both of those cuts at once before you have to switch the bit. With the router bit installed, I can now come in and set the depth on the actual cut. So loosening my lever on my plunge router, come in and just run that down until it bottoms out. The bit has now hit the top of the guitar sides there. And so that's my point of reference. Then I'm going to set my depth gauge over here on the side to make a 1/2 inch cut. The depth of this mortise is going to be actually just a skosh more than that. So let me set it up to be a 1/2 inch and just a skosh more. There we go. The actual depth on the tenon part of the joint then, the part of the neck, will be exactly a 1/2 inch. So I have a little bit of wiggle room in there. So I've got the depth set, I've got the bit in there, it's locked in tight. Now I'm ready to power up. Don't power up while you're setting up your router. Just a word to the wise there. Also make sure you're going to use ear protection, dust protection, and also eye protection. Okay, I've got my router all set up, ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and make the first pass. Now you want to do this in several passes. Don't try and hog out all this material in just one pass. You want to do it in probably 6 passes or more. So I'm going to take about 1/8 of an inch every time. So here we go. Power up the router. Now, when you make your final pass, you notice I turned the router off. I let the bit completely stop spinning before I removed it from the jig. And there's why. That bit is completely exposed. You could ruin the template. You could also ruin your leg or your arm or wherever you set the router. We're not too worried about that. I'm more worried about my template. No, I'm just kidding, guys. Make sure that you wait until that bit completely stops spinning, or raise the router bit so that it's back inside the housing of the router. It's very important. Don't get anxious. Pull that router out of there before it's time. So here's what the cut looks like. We've hogged out the majority of the material. Notice that the walls are still straight. And I've stopped short back here at the end. Notice how the depth of cut did not go all the way to the binding. It stopped short just a little bit. I'm probably about 3/16 of an inch away from that binding. So now that the mortise side of the joint is done, let's work on the tenon side, or the neck side. Now I see a problem already. I notice that if I place a straight edge across here, that this is high and that this is low. It's got a gap in there. And that's because of the angle that we set on the neck. So I've got to come in and somewhat mimic that angle on the end grain here of the heel block so that that thing is sitting in there at the correct angle. That way the router is flush here, the router is flush here. The way it is now, I'm going to get a deeper cut here and a shallower cut here. We don't want that. So I'm going to take it out of the jig. I'm going to kind of remember what that angle is. Looks to me like it's about an 1/8 of an inch gap here and 0 here. So I'm going to cut this 1/8 of an inch to 0. You could do it on a sander or whatever it takes. Just make sure that you have somewhat mimicked the angle on your shelf on the end of your end block there. So what I did is I just went over to my chop saw or my miter saw and I cut that angle on there. It doesn't have to be exact. I just somewhat mimicked it. All right, now I'm going to place this in here. Very easy to do with those dowels. And that looks much better. I have no daylight under there, so I can now hold it up against the template there, clamp it off with the toggle clamps down below, and I'm good to go. So I now have a flat surface here to work with. So I need to set the depth of my router again, because the depth on this side is pretty close to the depth of my template. On the other side, though, I've got a large gap because the guitar is recessed down in there. So now I'm going to place this on there, bottom it out, and reset my depth gauge over here on the side of my router to exactly 1/2 inch. So here's my depth gauge, and I came in and measured with my ruler exactly 1/2 inch. And you could come in and use a shim or something if you wanted to there, but I want to make sure that the tenon is just a skosh undersized compared to my mortise. So I'm going to start my router. I'm going to start by going about 1/8 of an inch. That's it on the first cut. And here we go. Once again, you'll notice how I allowed the router to either stop spinning or recess that bit up into the cavity like I did on the base. That way, when you remove the router, you won't muck up your template, and you also won't hurt yourself. So here's what the joint looks like after the cut. Now I need to swap out the bit, put in a 7-degree angle dovetail bit, then I'm going to run around both the mortise and tenon side of the joint and put the angle on there. So when adjusting anything on the router, make sure you're powered down, unplug everything, that way there's no surprises. So I'm going to remove the straight cut bit. Remember that was once again a 3/8 inch straight cut bit. And I'm going to place the dovetail bit in. Now the dovetail bit is just a little bit wider at the tip than the actual guide bushing. So you want to be really careful. You may even have to just recess this just a little bit, and I think I'm going to do that. So I'm just going to plunge it down a little bit so it's kind of closer to my final cut. That way, when I place the bit in here, it's sticking out the end and it won't hit the collet or the guide bushing. Alright, so the bit's secure. Now it doesn't matter if I cut the mortise or the tenon. Since I'm already on the tenon side, I'll go ahead and do that. I need to readjust my depth though. So now it's easy. I just go ahead and bottom it out right there. And I'm at the correct depth. Now the reason why we use a straight cut bit to hog everything out first is because when you put the dovetail bit in, you got to do it in a single pass. You can't plunge, if not you'll have a straight wall. We want the slanted wall that the dovetail offers. So now I'm going to power back up the router. I've got the depth set. I'm going to slide it off to the side over here, power up the router, and cut the final pass. On this pass, when I turn the router off, I allowed the bit to completely stop spinning because I don't want to retract it into the housing, because that bit is very close to the final inside diameter of that guide bushing, and I don't want to run the risk of hitting it against the guide bush. So I'm just going to leave it out like that, and now I'm going to come in and cut the other side. So just like on the other side, I've got to reset the depth. It's very easy to do. Just make sure that this goes all the way down. You may need to adjust your depth gauge. Just make sure it goes all the way down, bottoms out. With the router depth adjusted, you're now ready to make the cut. The reason why I'm having to reset the depth from the mortise to the tenon side is that because of this template, it's held in place with the set screws and the insert from the back side, the T-nut. Now if you could recess that T-nut in there a little bit, it would allow you to bring your guitar all the way up against the shelf here, or the tabletop, and you can do that on both sides. You wouldn't have to reset your depth. Now when I built the jig, I didn't do that, but if you wanted to reset those T-nuts a little bit and allow you to bring that guitar body up just a little bit more, and they should be exactly the same depth, you don't have to reset all the time. Okay, so I'm set to the correct depth. I'm going to go ahead and make the cut. Once again, allow the bit to stop spinning before you pull it out of there. And I now have nice angled walls on both the mortise and tenon side, the neck and the body. And if I did everything correctly, when I insert the joint together, the neck will not fit. I want to do some handwork. I want to leave it just a little bit proud of my initial cut. And this is something you have to dial in before you use the jig. The reason for that is if my angle is off just a little bit, I can correct that and still have enough room to slide right down into the jig. If the angle is okay and I'm getting the correct gap back at the saddle, then it's very easy to just remove a little bit by hand and it just slide right down in there so it's flush with the guitar top. So let's pull everything apart and see how we did. So I'm going to start by removing the neck. Remove the toggle clamps. Neck comes right out. There's our cut. It has a nice angle on there for the dovetail. You'll notice that around the edges, out here, I've got some fuzzies, and that's because of the router. What I do is I carve my neck on my guitar. If you're one of those guys who likes to carve the neck off the guitar, then just run a piece of masking tape or duct tape around there to hold the fibers in together, or just don't take it as close to your final measurement before you actually cut your joint. Then take it on down to your final measurement. To remove the body, all I'm going to do is just loosen the knobs here, and the body slides right out. And as you can see, we have a very nice mortise for our dovetail joint on this end. Notice how I didn't go all the way to the edge of the guitar. I stopped short, and the neck will come about to the edge of the binding, then the heel cap cover will take us about halfway through the binding. Okay, so I took the neck and the body out of the jig. And I'm going to do a slight test fit here. If we did everything correctly, it should not fit. And that is correct. I've got about a 1/4 inch proud of the actual top. In other words, it needs to go down in there about another 1/4 inch. But I always stop right about there. The reason for that is, if I need to make any adjustments to my angle, I still have room to do it. Okay, so now I can still check my angle. I'm going to place a straight edge on there, make sure that the joint is engaged, it's tight. Then I'm going to put this on here, and I'm going to check my gap back here, and I'm coming in at about 14 millimeters. And if I check the gap that I have sticking out above the soundboard, I'm coming in at about 10.5 millimeters. So if I subtract the two, I've got a gap of 3.5 millimeters. So I know that I'm okay there. Something else that I want to do is check my left to right. So I'm going to place a straight edge on my center line down here and my center line up here and check that. And that looks good as well. So if you needed to make a left or right adjustment, you still have enough room to do that. And this is the importance of doing this beforehand on scrap pieces. You can dial these tolerances in fairly tight, and you could bring it on down a little bit closer than the 1/4 inch I've left if you wanted to. So I know that my angle is correct. I know that my left to right is correct. All I need to do is slide that down into the mortise just a little bit more. So all I'm going to do is loosen my set screws and bring this template forward just a little bit. If you need to bring the template forward just a little bit more and you don't have the room here, it looks like I may have to adjust this just a little bit farther. I'll have to chisel out or route out just a little bit there, bring this forward just a little bit more. So I loosened my set screws, I brought the template back just a little bit more. Now I'm going to tighten it back up. Now you could do some of this on the mortise side as well. You could slide this back or forward before you cut it in the guitar. If you want to dial it in on your test pieces, you could do that. I'm dialing it all in from the tenon side. Then I'm going to place the neck back in the jig. It's very easy to do because I have the 1/4 inch dowels there that line up perfectly with my truss rod slot. I'm back in there ready to go. Now I can bring my router back in for another pass. All right, I'm going to take the neck out again, and I'm going to test my fit. Now, the beauty of this is you can place it back in here with precision every time because of those dowels in your truss rod slot, and you can walk this thing right into just where it's perfect. So I'm going to test the fit again. Come in and just slide that down into the joint. I've gone down a couple of millimeters. I got 3 or 4 more to go to make it flush. Now, something else you need to look out for when you're doing this is the depth of the tenon on the back side. Is it bottoming out? If it is, perhaps you need to take a little bit off this edge down here. And that's very easy to do. Let me show you how to do that. So I took a depth measurement in the actual mortise of the body and figured out that my tenon is just a little bit too long. So I can come in, cut that off right about there. It's not much, but I can actually take a little bit off of there. So I want to make sure that I have the same plane on the shoulders wrapping around this end down here. So if I come in with a nice wide chisel and just kind of come in a little bit like that around the edges there, and then come in and just pop that edge off, just folds right off of there, and do that again. And if you want to round the edges, you can. You can come in with a little bit of a chisel here and just kind of start the rounded edge. If you want to put a little bit of an angle on it like a dovetail, you can as well. If you want to round that even more, you can come in with a file. Just take it around like that. Same thing on this side. Make sure that your file doesn't mark up the shoulders here because we want no gaps around where that neck meets the body. And now we can test it for fit again. So I've removed some of the end of the tenon because apparently it was bottoming out just a little bit. I'm going to come in, place it back onto the guitar. And I'm a little bit closer to my final measurement. I've still got about 3 or 4 millimeters I need to go on down there. I'm going to put it back into my jig and slowly walk that in until it's about 1 millimeter above the top of that soundboard. Then I'm going to come in and do a little bit of handwork and have it slide right down in there. So I'm going to adjust my template slightly. And you want to do this very slightly because you don't want to blow past it so it's just loose in the joint there. You want to slowly sneak your way up on it. And if you do all this testing beforehand, you can get it a little closer. I just like to err on the side of caution. Once you've done this a few times though, you can dial this thing right in so it's going to fit perfect every time for you. So after one more pass, I'm going to come in, check it again, and I'm getting really close now. I've got about 1 millimeter there until I'm flush. So that's about where I like to stop. And I'm going to come in and work it just a little bit with a file and a chisel and bring it right down where it needs to be. And I'll show you how to do that. What I like to do is come in and figure out what the actual width of my fretboard is going to be. In my case, it's going to be about 56 millimeters at the 14th fret. So I'm going to divide that by 2. And that tells me the approximate width of my fretboard. So I've got some excess out here that needs to go away. Down here it's whatever the client wants. So I'm going to leave it a little bit wide at this point until I decide what this one wants to do. But all of this other excess out here, outside of my lines, is what's going to get carved away, which means that everything inside of my line on the shoulder of the tenon here is hitting the sides, making contacts with the sides of the guitar. And I don't necessarily want to do that. So if you come in and relieve this area just a little bit, the only place that you're going to be touching the guitar is out here on the edge. So let's just relieve that just a little bit. Around the end down here, you want to be very careful that you don't get it recessed too wide. So come in with a smaller chisel if you need to. Just recess at that just a little bit. So I've recessed all the way around there so that the shoulder is actually going back like this at an angle. That way I'm touching the sides of the guitar just right out here on the edges. And let's go check it again for fit. And now I'm about 1/2 millimeter proud of the actual top of the soundboard. So I'm going to work the sides of this joint just a little bit with some sandpaper or a file in my vise, and that should slide right down in there snug. Throughout this whole process, I've been checking my angle constantly. I've also been checking my left to right because you don't want that neck swinging right or left. You want that neck exactly on the center line. You don't want it left or right. So check that throughout this whole process. Check that and check your gap. Make sure you're staying where you need to be. So if I remove just a little bit of material on the sides of the angled part of the dovetail here on the tenon, that thing should slide right down where I need to be. I'm going to use a safe edge so I don't alter this side very much, and just very carefully come in and just file that. And it's not going to take much. And since I have a slight angle on my file, I can't get right down into the corner, so I'm going to come in with my chisel, just remove that little edge right there. And I'm going to test it for fit again. So after just a few passes on each side of the tenon here on the shoulders with that little file like I showed you, I'm going to place it in here again, test the fit, and it looks like it's going to slide all the way down in there flush with just a little bit of pressure. And there it is. I'm flush here, I'm flush here. But I'm not quite done yet. On the back side, I now know exactly where the neck is going to end. So I can come in and cut that off, and I like to cut it about flush with the binding there. So I'm going to come in and mark that with a pencil on each side, come in and cut that at a slight angle because the back is radiused, remember, and then I'll go ahead and glue this on. So I marked that and I just bumped it on my sander, and now it comes to about flush with where the binding hits the side. I've got about a 3 or 4 millimeter gap there. I'll put a heel cap on there. It'll come up about halfway through the binding, and I'll have a little step down onto my heel cap. And the angle somewhat matches the radius of the back. So now we're ready to glue it in. So once again, I've checked and double checked. I got the joint so it fits tight. I'm flush here, flush here. I put my straight edge on it. I checked my gap down at my saddle. I have a 3.5 millimeter gap. I also put it along the straight edge here, checked it for left to right. It comes right down the center of the truss rod all the way up into the peg head. So life is good. Let's apply a little bit of glue and clamp it. The beauty of the Dovetail is that it's a self-clamping joint. But I still like to put a little clamp on it. And you just want to put the glue on the sides of the tenon here. If you're gluing end grain to end grain, like if you put it here, it's really not doing much good. So I'm just making sure that I get it all on the side of that angled part there. That's what's going to hold everything together. And I'm going to come in here, place it on the guitar, and drive it home. There it is, flush there, a little glue squeeze out. And that came together real nice. Now if you take the time to dial in that jig, like I said, you can pretty much get this thing right on the first time. I just like to check it because things happen, things move around. So I like to leave it a little bit proud, that way I can come in and adjust that angle if I need to. Just because I can, I'm going to come in and check that angle one more time. And I want a 3.5 millimeter gap back at the saddle. That is exactly what I've got. I also want to check the center line. So if I hold my straight edge on here, put it on the center line down here at the bottom, center line up here, and then check the top, and yes, it is indeed centered all the way up the guitar. So life's good. So as a last resort, I like to come in and put a clamp on it. It is a self-clamping joint, so you don't necessarily need that. But if you come in and just place a little clamp right here, kind of holds everything together as the glue dries, keeps it from twisting and stuff. So there it is. Half-hour dry time, and this guitar is ready to continue building.